Hi, this is Catherine Starkhorn here at Country Club Christian Church. We are glad you are joining us for our reading for anti-racism, and Tyler is joining us to share his thoughts too.
Yeah, my name's Tyler Heston, and I'm the minister to youth here at Country Club. Thanks for joining.
We hope that this will give you a chance to think about some resources that are available and get to know Tyler and myself a little better about where we are in this journey of being involved in anti-racism work. I don't think it would be really much of an understatement to say that truly most of my life has been about race relations. My parents moved to Kansas City when I was 3, as my dad accepted a call as a minister at Covenant Presbyterian Church at 59th and Swope Parkway. At the time, it was the late 60s, and it was a majority white church, but it was in a neighborhood undergoing significant change, which I would say was probably the primary reason it appealed to him. Driven by the civil rights movement and a strong desire for the world to reflect what God must imagine as a peaceable kingdom, he, and actually my mom in those days, because you kind of came as a match set in ministry, went about building with lay leaders in the church what became a 500-member congregation of almost numerically equal whites and people of color. My mom was really civically active throughout her life also, with one of her most significant roles that I observed being her community leadership and her service on the Kansas City Public Schools Board of Directors, seeking to address the deep inequities within the school systems throughout the metro area. Tirelessly, she and the kitchen table cabinet, as they were called, since many meetings actually took place around people's kitchen tables, gathered data, drafted policies, and sought to engage people in authentic conversations about how the inequities in public education truly hurt everyone. And they advocated for equal opportunities and resources for kids in all the areas of the metro. Growing up, our family lived east of the Paseo in a predominantly Black community. I attended Francis Willard Elementary School through 3rd grade, where I was one of 10 children of white children in the entire kindergarten through 8th grade school. Only looking back to those days do I really understand, even in that setting, where I was in the minority, how my white privilege was ever present. I recall when in 1st grade, Walter Cronkite, who attended that school for some of his elementary years, came to talk to us, and about 8 students were called to have lunch with him. I recall the group had 3 of the white kids and 5 Black students, not representative of the makeup of the school in the least. During my 3rd grade year, I was invited to participate in a gifted and talented program in the school district, but no schools east of Troost had the program. So my school would be Bryant Elementary on Warnell Road. I know my parents wrestled with this decision, for it really ran counter to what they were seeking to live and model for us. When a classmate's mother called to say Marion had been invited to the program too, but they might not be able to participate due to the transportation issue, as a subtle way of offering inclusion, the district at that time would make it possible for students to be invited to the program, but if you did not live in the boundaries of Bryant School, you had to provide your own transportation, which was almost impossible for most families. And Marion's family was no different. They couldn't do that on a daily basis. So in the end, our family being able to assist getting Marion to school with us provided the needed permission for my parents to let me attend the program. Another painful learning I can kind of recall was more from my teen years, when I was an employee at McDaniel's Pharmacy a couple afternoons after school. And I worked at the front counter, and one of my first days there, I remember one of the managers coming up and kind of explaining things to me, but also letting me know that if more than 2 Black people or teens came in, I was to call the back counter and a manager or owner would come to monitor. I probably said nothing because I was just so stunned by someone saying that out loud to me, assuming I kind of had the same understanding of the world that she did. Several conversations with my parents helped process this, kind of through my in-the-face look at prejudice and the unjust world that we functioned in daily. Much of my encounters with systemic racism were through schools and the city, from white flight that left school enrollment predominantly students of color and from economically challenged areas, to the long battle over 71 Highway, which in effect split the African American neighborhoods and destroyed numerous Black-owned businesses and homes, to summer curfews and ordinances meant to limit groups of teens in predominantly white areas of the city. Kansas City has a troubled past and present of segregation and racism. One of the most stark physical and symbolic divisions in our city is Troost Avenue, among one of the longest streets running north to south in this area. And 95% of the people east of Troost are Black, and 95% of the people west of Troost are white. And truly, little has changed over many years. My husband and I bought our first and only home 25 years ago, and we live one block west of Troost. And not nearly enough has changed in that quarter of a century to blur any kind of racial divide along the Troost corridor. From my deep beliefs my parents instilled in me, I have always thought I was doing my best to live a life profoundly aware of racism and inequities in our community, our city, our country. Yet even with all my attempts to be well-read, to stay current with what is happening, my years of leading my own family to be inclusive and to foster relationships with people from all walks of life, striving to lend our privileged voices and power to advocate for basic equal rights and opportunities, I have truly been shocked in the past few years at the continued depth of racism in our country, and appalled at what I must now claim as my own white silence. And I must reckon with that. Both as a person seeking to be faithful and as a person with white privilege and power, I feel a deep sense of urgency to make this moment count, to not let it fizzle out, to help support the young, talented voices to create the world they envision that sees each and every as a beloved child of God. The time for holding one another accountable, not only to be knowledgeable, but to be more active, is now. And I truly am dancing on the edge of hope in this time and place. Tyler?
Awesome. Thank you, Catherine. So although I also live a block of Troost on the east side now, I'm just a few blocks south of Catherine, I did not grow up in Kansas City. I actually grew up in Memphis, Tennessee, which has its own interesting history of race and racism. My family moved there when I was 3 years old, and we landed in a suburban annex of the city in the very southeast corner. You can see it marked out on this map I have for you. By the time, or a couple years after we moved there, it became a Black middle-class neighborhood. We moved into that neighborhood around the year 2000, right around the time that the last of the families who built the houses in the neighborhood were moving to new houses they were building in established suburbs, mainly Collierville, down on the southeast corner of Memphis. Went to church out in Collierville and ended up going to a private school out in that suburb by the time I was in late elementary school. And it only took me a few years of going to school out there to realize that kids in the suburbs thought that I lived in the ghetto, because I lived in the city in a neighborhood where only a few white people lived. So growing up in Memphis, learning about the civil rights movement was learning about local history. Field trips all throughout school brought the stories of Martin Luther King Jr., the protests and strikes of the civil rights era to life. Those things happened the same places that my life happened. You can see on this slide a photo I took of a recent trip home to Memphis of a mural downtown that commemorates the 1968 Memphis sanitation worker strike that actually brought Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to Memphis, where he gave his "I've been to the mountaintop" speech just a day before his assassination. The civil rights history was close to me as a kid. But for most of my life, something felt off in how we talked about race in Memphis, at least in my world, and I couldn't explain it. We talked about racism as if it was something in the past, that, maybe we beat it in the 60s. Although I saw firsthand how separated our city was, and I knew internally that something was wrong. However, it took me until college until I could understand the dynamics of racism in Memphis and elsewhere a bit better. But first, I had to come to a new understanding of myself. It was in college that I came out as gay. The world I grew up in told me that being gay was a choice and that it was a sin. And it took me going to college and meeting new people with new perspectives to see myself more clearly. As I came to peace with myself as a gay man and as a Christian, I came to see the ways in which oppression is a systemic thing. There are systems in our society built to repress certain people. Once I understood myself as a gay man, I saw the ways in which there was systemic resistance and suppression to who I was, both in Memphis and across the country and the world. So as the dust settled on my own coming out journey, around that time was when Michael Brown was viciously murdered in Ferguson, Missouri, just a few hours away from us here in Kansas City and a few hours away from where I was in Memphis. As the nation erupted and as the Black Lives Matter movement was born, I could finally see clearly how racism was a systemic thing. It was so much more than an outdated opinion of some people, but it was something baked deeply into the system that I lived in. It kept not just individuals, but communities suppressed and withheld from them the liberation and the flourishing they truly deserve. I could see finally that racism was deep in the systems that I grew up in Memphis, even the institutions that meant a lot to me. I realized in college that my high school was one of many private schools built in the 60s as a private Christian high school that simply provided an alternative to the now desegregated public schools. So many private schools, like the ones I went to in Memphis, were open because in the 60s, families were scared of sending their kids to segregated schools, so they built their own. In the years since my eyes were open to systemic racism have been years of growth and of new understandings. I feel like now more than ever, I'm aware of how much more I still have to learn about what it means to be white in a world where people with Black and brown bodies are oppressed in ways I'm not, about what my responsibility is to be a part of the change. It's interesting because I even see the ways in which racism has its hold on the progressive circles in which I run. The LGBTQ plus community has its own issues with racism. And I've learned how hard it is to practice anti-racism even in those circles. It's a long game. Anti-racism is a long game, but it's necessary. So that's why we're here today. We want to offer some steps towards education because we believe education is important. Because anti-racism is a long game, we must strive not only to act, but to be informed. In some of my work with the LGBTQ community, doing advocacy and activism, I've encountered difficulties around conversations about race that have arisen because we have different frameworks and understandings of what racism is. In Memphis, I couldn't talk about anti-racism until I understood that it was more than an issue of individual attitude. That's why we believe education about racism is important, because we need a common framework for what racism is. Another note I want to make, I keep on seeing people talk on social media about how those of us who are joining this conversation about Black Lives Matter, police brutality, especially among people of color, that we can't expect to dive in and get everything right from the beginning. We love to be right from the very outset. But the work of anti-racism isn't something we start out perfectly. Kind of like Catherine talked about, it's a practice in which we must continue to seek growth. We have to be willing to confront our own mistakes. We have to be willing to listen when others guide us into a different way of seeing things. Because the truth is that racism has been a monster in this country since its very beginnings. Since the genocide of the native people who lived on this land before the settlers came, to slavery and the ways in which racial inequality has evolved in the years since then. There isn't enough that we can do, but we must simply begin. And we also believe that us white people need to be diligent in educating ourselves. There are ample resources out there. We have what we need to do this work of education. We can no longer say that we don't know what to do. Our Black siblings and other siblings of color have long been telling us what's wrong and how we can make changes. They're tired of us not listening. And in this moment, we're invited to take it upon ourselves to learn and to turn that learning into action.
So as we embark on this work of education and action together, Tyler, thank you for sharing your story. I always love to hear you talk. We've decided that having a common foundation for what we are talking about is key. Recently, I read an article and I shared it with Tyler, and he kind of agreed that it was a good way to sort of add some definition to some things, but it was an article called What Ralph Lauren and My Mom Taught Me About Bias, Prejudice, Discrimination, and Racism. And it was by author and commentator Doug Speed. And within it, he shares definitions from his mother, who is a college professor. I found his story illustrating these terms in action helpful, and the definitions demonstrate the distinct difference between bias, prejudice, discrimination, and racism, and the progression of one to the next. So for our purposes in terms of recommending resources and kind of having a common discussion, bias is the root of all unequal treatment and is typically held deep within the subconscious. It's our inherent bias, rendering the individual largely unaware of its presence. Biases can be formed by life experiences or learned and internalized from others. Prejudice literally means to judge in advance in its Latin form. Often we may mentally or outwardly judge others based on nothing other than our own personal biases that take in outward appearances and actions of others, and we process and make determinations about that person or that situation. They may simply be thoughts, spoken comments, or sometimes manifested as we move into other ways that we exhibit these. Now, when someone harbors biases, they prejudge others, and then the active part is discrimination, which is to treat some people differently than they would treat people for whom they harbor no negative bias. Bias and prejudice can be somewhat passive in nature. Discrimination, however, is where unfair treatment becomes active. The person of color who is followed around the store by the security guard, the homeowner calling the police on a young Black man simply walking in the neighborhood. These actions are discrimination that are lived out due to bias and prejudice. When discrimination is carried out at an institutional scale toward a certain population due to racial differences, for example, across a company, a school, a city, a nation, that is racism. And the author of the article cautions us not to misuse or overuse the term racism, lest we minimize its severity. Recent protests and demonstrations are shining a huge spotlight on the racist institutions that are the bedrock of our country, and we are called to understand them and to act.
Awesome. So before we introduce some books and texts that we recommend, I want to share with you two Martin Luther King quotes that help kind of ground this work for me. Recent weeks, like Catherine said, have shown us that we need to do some healing and do some deep work on our systems and institutions before we can jump and hold hands and unite and be a united, diverse country that we want to be. Like we said, this is a long game. The work of anti-racism is a long game of learning to understand and learning to take action based on our understandings. Our education means nothing if it doesn't catalyze into actual action and change. So there are a couple of quotes that kind of help ground this work for me, like I said, from Martin Luther King Jr. This first, you may know, I'm pretty sure President Barack Obama had this posted in the White House during his time there. But it's the quote, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." I always remind myself of this whenever I feel a little bit hopeless in the pursuit of justice, when I feel too small in this big old universe. This quote reminds me that no, things are moving towards where they need to be, that God is bending this universe towards justice. But sometimes I hear this quote and I'm tempted into passivity, thinking, okay, the universe is big, it's headed in the right direction. Does anything I do actually matter? Recently, I came across this other quote from Dr. Martin Luther King, in which he says, "Let nobody give you the impression that the problem of racial injustice will work itself out. Let nobody give you the impression that only time will solve the problem. That's a myth, and it's a myth because time is neutral. Somewhere we must come to see that human progress never rolls in on wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless efforts and the persistent work of diligent individuals." So this is where we are. We believe that we are saying yes to God's invitation to give our own tireless effort and persistent work, starting with the diligence of learning so that we can act in ways that are informed and helpful and participate in God's healing of our world. Catherine, you're muted.
Had to do that. Had to do that at least once in our conversation. So a book that I would recommend is more of a novel, and it's been made into a movie, probably been around for a while. But this novel is based on too many real experiences, and it immerses the reader in the reality of too many of our fellow Americans' daily experience. The book, The Hate You Give, has a main character named Star Carter, who is constantly switching between the two worlds, the poor, mostly Black neighborhood where she lives, and the wealthy, mostly white prep school that she attends. The uneasy balance between these worlds is soon shattered when she witnesses the fatal shooting of her childhood best friend at the hands of a police officer. Facing pressure from all sides of the community, Star must find her voice and decide to stand up for what's right. The novel involves us all, or invites us all to be a part of the story as we encounter the complex and systemic racism many people are swirling in throughout our country. For those of us living with safety and control, we can use this novel to understand some of the issues of racism and police violence through the author's voice, which is filled with intelligence and heart and painful honesty. My family did this book as a book read, one of the things I keep trying to shove on my family. Let's read some more books. But it was a wonderful opportunity to have frank discussion about what some young people face and what communities of color go through more regularly. And I love this quote from the book. That's the problem. We let people say stuff, and they say it so much that it becomes okay to them and normal for us. What's the point of having a voice if you're going to be silent in those moments you shouldn't be? And that gives you just a little feel for what that experience will be like. Another book that I have found as a middle-aged white woman to be really helpful for me was written by Debbie Irving, called Waking Up White. And this book is a collection of moments in time from the author's life, moments that truly awaken Irving to her own bias and prejudice, and ultimately a painful understanding of her white silence. She shares, I've met hundreds of white people across America who share feelings of race-related confusion and anxiety I experience. This widespread phenomena of white people wanting to guard themselves against appearing stupid or racist or radical has resulted in an epidemic of silence from people who care deeply about justice and love for their fellow human beings. Irving shares touching and relatable stories throughout the book that not only shine light on how she becomes in tune with her missteps and offer a connection for many of us in our own journey, from owning her own ignorance and totally misguided efforts and false assumptions, she offers the reader a chance to reflect on our own actions and choices. After each chapter or story, there's a question or a prompt for you to reflect and wrestle with where those words or that experience might have been in your life. Irving reminds us that no one is really born racist. It's taught and learned. And understanding how and why our beliefs developed along racial lines holds the promise of healing and liberation. And I love this phrase, and the unleashing of America's vast human potential. Another book that I have turned to over a year ago when my son was at Drake University, one of his religious professors, Dr. Jennifer Harvey, a text she wrote was lifted up to me. And it's a book called Raising White Kids in a Racially Unjust America. And I would start by saying it's not just for parents. It is kind of geared towards them because she's talking about how parents and people that work with children really can mold them and help them grow in these understandings. But it gives tools to examine all the ways we either help or hurt children as they develop their racial identity. And I had never really thought about how important and a part of our development a racial identity is. But Harvey explains that racial development is no different than physical, intellectual, or emotional. And I know I have at times thought being colorblind is what we need, but quickly have come to understand not only is that impossible, but it does nothing to further equity and racial justice. We see color, we see it, and our society informs how we understand what different skin colors mean. Within a few months of being born, babies begin to observe and absorb and even respond to the racial dimensions of our society. Children continue to do so throughout their development, day in and day out. And assuming we will absorb openness and acceptance of others by simply saying all are equal, diversity is good, is untrue. We must consciously engage in understanding, naming, appreciating, and knowing how race matters in daily life. A book study on this book is going to be offered, and I've already had some parents sign up, but it's a wonderful way to not only examine how you understand race in the world, but to begin to think about how you can shape a young person's life. And again, it is not just about being a parent, because so many of us have influence and conversations and presence with children. One of the quotes I really like is beside her cover here that says, "Thick layers of silence have tended to pervade white communities, and when it comes to honest, explicit discussions of race, whether a result of anxiety and awareness of racial tension or ingrained habits created by the discourse of color blindness, the long-term effects of silence are powerful. They make it difficult for many white adults to begin to speak about race openly and explicitly. There is simply no way around the awkward, challenging feelings of starting to talk about race." And so I invite you to turn to one of these texts, and Tyler's going to offer some more, but also to be engaged in a book group, because reading it in isolation, we can all say, oh, yeah, but if we hold each other accountable, that is where we will really begin to sense change and be a part of the change.
Agreed. Thank you, Catherine. So I'm going to introduce two books about which I will be offering some book studies for our church members. And yeah, I have like a whole shelf if anyone's interested in more book recommendations in the future. But the first one that I will be offering a book study for our church is Austen Channing Brown's I'm Still Here, Black Dignity in a World Made for Whiteness. So this book is a brutal and powerful book in which Austen talks about her experience being a Black woman in America. She starts off talking about how her parents gave her the name Austen Channing Brown because Austen Channing Brown sounded a lot more like a white man than a Black woman, and they thought it would help her in life. So she uses a lot of narrative, a lot of her own stories to talk about the experience of being Black in a world made for whiteness that pretends it's colorblind and more progressive than it actually is. She's a Christian leader, so she speaks theologically from her personal experience, talks a lot about like the Christian nonprofits that she's worked for who declare diversity and inclusion and say that they're committed to anti-racism, yet still perpetuate racism, and how difficult it's been for her to find truly inclusive communities. This book is a great read because it's honest. It's difficult for us white folk to read some of her stories, I think, but it's piercing. And in the truth, we find freedom. And she's honest that one of the last chapters is standing in the shadow of hope. She doesn't pretend that things are all rosy and things will be fine as soon as people read this book. But that we can still commit to action even when we feel like we're only standing in the shadow of hope. It's an excellent text. One of the quotes I like from it says, "Our only chance at dismantling racial injustice is being more curious about its origins than we are worried about our comfort. It's not a comfortable conversation for any of us. It's risky and messy. It's haunting work to recall the sins of our past. But is this not the work we have been called to anyway? Is this not the work of the Holy Spirit to illuminate truth and inspire transformation? It's haunting, but it's also holy." So it's a great book about her experiences and naming how God has been true for her and how she's understood her relationship with God being a Black person, a Black woman in a world made for whiteness. So I'll be aiming this book study for young adults aged 18 to 30 years old. And I invite you to visit this link you see on your screen. We'll make it available elsewhere to give some feedback about when and where you would like to meet. Anybody else, though, please reach out to me if you're interested in reading this book together. It's amazing. So the other book I'll be offering a book study on is another Christian book. It's a little more history than it is story. It's Jim Wallace's America's Original Sin, Racism, White Privilege, and the Bridge to a New America. I have the less pretty version in my hand. So Jim Wallace is a progressive evangelical minister and activist. He grew up in the suburbs of Detroit, where he was kind of conscientized to the racism in America. His story sounds a bit like mine, which is interesting. And for decades, he's been on the forefront of Christian activism against racism, against all sorts of violence and evils that still plague our country. You may know his work was through Sojourners magazine, which I'm pretty sure he launched and has been publishing for decades. And amazing, I read their articles a lot, so I'd recommend them. But this book is incredible because it really gives a history of what race is, what white privilege is, how we got to where we are today. Kind of like the quote in Austen Channing Brown's book said, like, we can't go forward until we name our history. And that's what Jim Wallace is trying to do in this book. So he traces all the way back to the beginnings of our country, in which oftentimes people who proclaim Christianity like spearheaded the murder of the native folk in our country, and began the institution of slavery. So he named slavery and the genocide of indigenous folk on this land as America's original sin, things from which we still need freedom from, but we need to repent from. So he uses like the language we have as Christians to understand the issue of racism and how race was invented to be a tool of power for white people in our country and beyond. And so it's a really interesting read, a lot of good information, and from a theological standpoint and just from a historical standpoint, but also some great ways forward. He talks about the bridge to a new America, and talks about how within 20 years, we're going to be a country of a majority minority. There's going to be less white people than there are non-white people in our country. And how if we want to step into that like as a healed country and with more wholeness, there are some things we have to do in the meantime. So I think this book is an incredible read for us as a church because it gives us the history that we need, but ties it to our faith identity, to the ways in which God is calling us to build a bridge to a new America. So you see some of this in the quote I have from this book. Racism is rooted in sin, or evil, as non-religious people may prefer, which goes deeper than politics, pointing fingers, partisan maneuvers, blaming, or name-calling. We can get to a better place only if we go to that morally deeper place. There will be no superficial or merely political overcoming of our racial sins. That will take a spiritual and moral transformation as well. Sin must be named, exposed, and understood before it can be repented of. So I believe, Jim Wallace believes, that racism is a deeply spiritual issue, that we as churches have been too quiet, too much on the sidelines for too long, that God invites us not just to watch the conversations about racism, but to be in the middle of them. Jesus got into the thick of things to transform the world. As followers of Jesus, that's what we're called to do too. So I'm opening up book studies for this book. I would love to do a couple of them for anyone in the church who's interested, regardless of age, where you are in life. I think this is an important book for us to read together, to learn more about the history and name God's invitation to participate in healing in the future. So if you want to visit this link that you see on your screen, it's a little Google form as well, and you can give me some information about when and where you might be able to meet to talk and read this book. I'm Still Here, I'm planning to do that one just kind of regularly on Sundays. Jim Wallace actually has a great book study guide for this book, so we can do it in a 4-part study throughout July. If you'd like to join a later one, please reach out and email me. We're kind of doing this on a rolling basis. But yeah, so those are the books that we have to offer. If you have any questions about these or other books, or just want to learn more and learn how to join the conversation, we invite you to reach out to us. My email is tylerh@ccccKC.org. Yeah, Catherine?
Yeah, and I would just go back to Tyler's slide about this is the long game. So we're doing some things this summer. We know people are traveling and doing different things. This is not a one-up. This is a beginning point because there's much work to be done, much learning to be had, and then much action to be taken. So we do hope that you will begin to think about what would be a good fit for you, where you might be able to be entering into the conversation. And then our dream is that from our church community, we would then take it back to our own other different spheres of influence, whether it be parents meeting with other school parents or within a neighborhood community, something like that. But we as the church are called to do this hard work, to hold each other accountable, and to bring about the vision of what God has for this wonderful, amazing creation. So we thank you for listening. My email, which is really kind of long and painful, is Catherine, which is CATHERINESC@ccckkc.org. Or you can just go to the church website and you can find both of us. So we look forward to hearing your reactions, and I'm sure you all have been doing some great reading too. These are just ones that we think are very accessible to a wide range of people. So thanks for your time.
Awesome. Thank y'all.